Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. Global leaders, climate experts and NGOs are now in the city of Belém, Brazil, ready for the negotiations to begin at COP30. They're gathering at the place known as the Gateway to the Amazon against a rather depressing backdrop, with the latest figures showing global temperatures still rising and climate targets missed by almost every country in the world. So what can we expect from this COP? And have we left it too late to save the planet? Here with me now is de Boer, former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's great to have you on the agenda. Now, most of the global leaders have come and gone. Now is when the hard negotiations are about to begin. So what's really at stake at COP30?
Probably the main thing is to get a sense of the degree to which countries from around the world are still committed to addressing this issue, in the sense that what's happened in the United States, of course, has had a major impact, not just in terms of the climate change negotiations and that agenda itself, but more broadly in terms of international development cooperation, how the UN is seen, etc. So it's a very important moment to take the temperature of climate action.
You mentioned the United States policy, but what else has changed, would you say, since the last COP that maybe gives you hope that real progress can be made in Brazil?
Well, what's changed since the last COP, I think, is that in many parts of the world, certainly in most industrialized countries, the economy is not exactly doing great. And in many parts of the world, especially in Europe where I live, there's a tendency when the economy is not doing well to look backwards rather than forward. So to look back and say, we used to be really good at manufacturing, maybe we should go back to that again. So you see in many parts of the world that the economic issues are top of the agenda, and that's pushing climate back a bit. I do hope that this COP will give some clear signals on how countries from around the world are willing to engage.
I mean, it is the first COP since the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement for a second time. How do you see that affecting the talks, the negotiations, the real progress?
I think it affects things inside and outside the negotiations. I mean, the United States is a big international player, has a very important international role, and has a great deal of influence on other countries inside the process. So in that sense, the absence of the US, the absence of the resources that it used to put into the system, not just the negotiating system, but the UN more broadly, has a huge impact. And then, of course, there's the impact in terms of the many countries around the world that have so far happily relied on financial support from the United States and are seeing that disappear as well. So there are impacts inside the negotiations and outside.
But as the United States seems to be pulling back from its green agenda, China appears to be getting greener. It was a key element of discussions for the country's next 5-year plan at the recent plenum. Is China now leading the way in tackling climate change?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, roughly, I think you can generally put people's response to climate into 3 categories. The first category is that they think it's a hoax. The second category is that they think it's a threat. And the third category is that they think it's an opportunity. So I think a lot of Europeans fit into the second category, the threat, that they worry about the impact of climate action on their economies. Whereas China, I think, through everything it's done on wind, on solar, on battery technology, on electric vehicles, has really recognized the market potential of addressing climate change. So for China, I think it's not just about addressing an important environmental issue. It's perhaps even more about capitalizing on markets for the future.
At the end of the last COP, there was a loose agreement on climate finance. It's all about money in the end, isn't it?
Well, money's important in the sense that there is an obligation on the part of rich countries to support developing countries to engage on climate change. I mean, that's been there ever since the Climate Change Convention was signed in Rio. But at the end of the day, to my mind at least, public finance is always going to be the icing on the cake. At the end of the day, there has to be a sound business case that engages the private sector. And then the question is, how can you use public finance to draw that private finance into the market, and to address issues around risk, around rate of return, and around size of market?
At each COP, there seems to be this standoff over banning fossil fuels. We're never really going to get over that, are we?
Well, I think we'll get out of it. The question is how do we get out of it?
Yeah.
To quote an old saying, I mean, the Stone Age didn't end because the stones were finished. The Stone Age ended because we found something better. We're already at a point at the moment where investments in renewable power generation have overtaken investments in coal-fired power generation. So for me, the central question is, when do we reach a tipping point when, from a market perspective, wind, solar, electric vehicles actually become financially more attractive than the way we do things at the moment?
So when do you think that tipping point is going to come?
I think we're very close to that tipping point in many parts of the world, but of course, the world is not equal. We talked earlier about finance. What you see in Africa, for example, is that the cost of capital is many times higher than what capital costs in an industrialized country. But then interestingly, you see in Africa a huge boom in solar panel sales from China in that part of the world. So different countries, depending on their different economic circumstances, tend to find and need different solutions.
And what about those most vulnerable countries, the ones who tend to be more adversely affected by the ravages of climate change? Should more be done to help them by the richer countries who are polluting more?
Definitely. I think when I got into this issue, I must confess, 30 years ago, the only item on the agenda was reducing emissions. And now I think there's almost equal attention for addressing the impacts of climate change and addressing the concerns of vulnerable countries. But here, once again, with aid budgets around the world declining the way they have been in recent years, it's difficult to find public finance to support adaptation. And it's probably more difficult to make a business case, a commercial investment, around adapting to the impacts of climate change than around reducing emissions.
If you could send one message to those attending COP30, what would it be and why?
I think my signal would be, give us a strong sign of encouragement, show us that the world is committed to addressing climate change, show us that leaders are serious about engaging on this topic and about engaging their countries. Because at the end of the day, I think that many of the solutions will come from the private sector. And what the private sector does, very importantly, is look at the signals it's getting from government and use that to determine whether it's worthwhile engaging and in which time frame.
Ivo de Boer, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ahead of the gathering in Belém, the European Union just managed to come up with a new climate plan, which is either weak and disappointing or a strong, united signal to the global community, depending on your viewpoint. Joining me now is former EU Director General for the Environment and current Senior Advisor at Shearwater Global, Karl Falkenberg. Great to have you on the agenda. Look, we're 10 years on from the landmark Paris Agreement of 2015, but the world is supposed to have come up with its latest set of national determined contributions. But many countries haven't. What is it about this COP that you think might shift the dial?
Wow, big question. I'm not over optimistic in going out or looking out to Belém. The world, broadly speaking, is looking more at competitiveness, economic growth, than at the environmental or climate damage that we're doing in the way in which we are trying to restart our respective societies, our respective economies. So what's there on the other hand that is perhaps positive? We do see that for the first time, renewable energies have produced more electricity than coal or fossil fuels, other fossil fuel bases. So there is a shift. 35% worldwide of energy have come from renewable energies now, but it's still a long way to go. We still need to get off major amounts. Europe, I think, still is in a leading position because we have effectively decoupled economic growth from using fossil fuels. But we also are beginning to see problems within our 27 member states. There is a political shift for the moment. I think that's undoubted. And that's why it has been so difficult for Europe to actually agree on a new target for 2040 to be presented at Belém.
But they have finally come up with an agreement, potentially avoiding the embarrassment of turning up at Belém empty-handed. But it's far from the contribution that we were expecting, right?
Well, it basically still confirms the 90% reduction by 2040. But the one thing that critics are looking at is that there is a potential of up to 5% of reductions being reached via credits, i.e. reductions in other countries. And when it comes to it, I don't find that such a bad idea at all, because we need to globally reduce our emissions. Europe's share in the emissions is down to something like 6%. So what we need to focus on if we really want to have an impact on climate change is the 94 other percent. And a lot of those are coming from weaker countries who may need assistance. And if through carbon credits we can help them reduce, we might get more reductions for €1 spent than if we were to do everything just in Europe. And I think that's where I see something that is hopefully moving, because even reducing Europe to 100% in 2040 is not going to be doing all that much good to the world if the rest of the world is not following. So I think it's actually something that I would rather see as a positive sign.
Where do you think that real progress might be made in Belém? Or is it perhaps time to think about forgetting these COPs and looking elsewhere for true progress in the fight against climate change?
I have been critical of the COPs for a long time. I think they are oversized and they're not very efficiently run. And we can see that in individual countries, not necessarily at the national level, but at the municipal level very often, at federal state level, at the level of individual companies, we do see things moving. That's why I was saying in the beginning, 35% of the energy we use comes from renewable energies globally. And there are countries in Europe where we're nearly at 50%. So individual countries are shifting. I think a lot of companies have started to look into shifting. I know that there are structures of municipalities who are trying to work together. And in municipalities, the mayors are very close to their local reality, and energy production is beginning to be more decentralized. We see more investments going into green energy sources. So there is movement. The problem that I see is that we need to upscale these individual or these local efforts if we want to meet the urgency, because in my view, even 2040 is too far away. I think the next 5 years will be very, very important to know how much of warming we will have to suffer and how many key ecosystems are we likely to lose. One of which is, for example, the Arctic. The ice in the Arctic is melting away very, very rapidly. And we may see in the next 5 to perhaps 10 years dramatic changes in weather conditions related to the loss of this ecosystem. So we clearly need to act rapidly. And I still believe that scaling up is best done if we do it together. But it seems to be still difficult to do it in the environmental area, where I fear a number of countries are still playing free rider approaches and think that if others move, they won't have to move as fast or as hard. That's a problem. That's a problem we're facing.
Karl Falkenberg, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And let's continue now with our discussion of what's at stake at COP30 in Brazil. Joining me now is Benjamin Horton, Dean of the School of Energy and Environment at Hong Kong University. Great to have you on the agenda. Now, the UN announced this week that the world has failed to meet its main climate change target of limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that will likely breach that threshold in the next decade. Is it game over, or can something happen at this COP to change it?
Well, I think to answer that question, it's important to understand how critical that threshold is. I mean, that threshold was set by the scientific community. We were asked, I would say, about over 10 years or so ago now to say, well, with the increase in greenhouse gases, we know our temperature's going to rise, but what limit should we place on it so you don't pass important planetary boundaries? And so the scientific community came together and said, well, the threshold is 1.5 degrees C. And I was involved in some of that research to the aspects that I study, which is sea level rise. We studied observational measurements, we looked at models, we looked at geological evidence of the stability of the Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheet. And we stated that if temperatures went above 1.5 degrees C and stayed there, that these ice sheets would become unstable and would result in multi-metre sea level rise. And multi-metre sea level rise inundates every single coastal city on planet Earth. And we live along the coastline, we work along our coastline, and our infrastructures along our coastline, even if you don't think about our valuable ecosystems. So we set this threshold. It was part of the Paris Agreement in 2005, and I don't think any scientist thought that society would be stupid enough not to listen to these experts, and then we find out in 2024 and 2025 that we've overshot this threshold. So it's exceedingly worrying. What we don't know as a scientific community is how long we can stay above this threshold before these tipping points are crossed. And the important thing to be aware of is that when these tipping points are crossed, they're permanent, certainly within a human lifespan. So you wouldn't be able to regrow an ice sheet, for example, to stop that multi-metre sea level rise. So we need to rapidly start to think about transitioning away from petroleum to lower the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere and try to return our temperatures below this threshold.
But there does seem to be a big gap in ambitions, doesn't there? I mean, China's target has been called modest by some, but it's probably achievable, cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% by 2035. Is it now time to look beyond the Paris Agreement?
Well, I think what we'd obviously always hoped was that innovation, be that in science, technology, engineering, would outpace the rate of climate change. And what we're seeing is the complete opposite. We're seeing that climate change is accelerating now. Hurricane Melissa is an example of that, with some recorded wind gusts in excess of 400 kilometers per hour, numbers that we hadn't ever dreamed that would occur on planet Earth. What we'd hoped is that the innovation, I mean, there are positive signs through the COP meetings. The COP meeting in Glasgow, COP26, started to show that the national targets with innovation would mean that we would go away from the highest emission scenarios to a lower emission future, which would take our temperature ranges, instead of warming the Earth by the end of this century by 3 to 5 degrees, somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees. But that still is a significant overshot. But there's a caveat to that. When we had COP26, we were only just at the beginning of the Ukraine war. We didn't think that that would last as long as it would do, with the horrific effects. We didn't have the Gaza war, and that we didn't have the explosion in energy required for AI data centers. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty on how fast we're going to overshoot. I just think that for the climate community, we're really trying to emphasize this urgency for innovation, this urgency for transition away from fossil fuels to the cheaper, more sustainable alternative of renewables.
You mentioned Glasgow, and that the goal of curbing deforestation was affirmed there at COP26 in 2021. But that initiative is now stalling. Belém is a port city, a gateway to the Amazon. Is it the ideal place to push that agenda again, do you think?
Well, again, with climate change, there are two parts to it. The first part is to reduce your emissions, but then the second part is to preserve the natural world. And why we need to preserve the natural world, just for climate change, if we ignore biodiversity, health impacts, but just for climate change, because that acts as the natural absorption of carbon dioxide. About 70% of the carbon dioxide that we emit when we turn on a light, when we turn on our cars, is absorbed by our oceans and our land. So what we need to do is desperately preserve that. And the Amazon, well, we think of it as the lungs of our planet. Under the previous administration, you had record-breaking deforestation. Within the current administration, there has been a significant reduction in deforestation, but I'm still using the word deforestation.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a change in sign to afforestation. So we're still not preserving what we have. And it's so critical for solving climate change. Climate change, is a very, very complex problem, but the solutions are relatively simple. Reduce the amount of emissions, and we have an alternative now in our renewables that in many cases are cheaper than our petroleum, and preserve our natural ecosystems. So having a conference in Brazil at the mouth of the Amazon is incredibly important. It certainly is a better optic than the previous two meetings, which took place in petrostates. So hopefully the optics will energize people, then they'll realize the importance of preserving the natural world for climate change, for biodiversity, for human health.
You talk about it inspiring the world, but what do you think about the role of China leading the charge when it comes to wind, when it comes to solar, and placing the green transition at the very heart of its latest 5-year plan?
Well, I think with the geopolitical change that we've seen in the United States over the last 9 months, and the attack on science, and particularly in climate science, with the leader of the free world calling it a con job, we need to think of alternatives. Europe, the United Kingdom, has always been very strong on climate change. But we've seen a new player emerge. We've seen a new player in China where they've seen that maybe the innovation, the economy transition in the 21st century will be the green economy. We've seen significant investment in technology, EV as an example, the sort of electrification of the transport network in China, and then the exportation of, we have the rare earth metals that are needed for batteries, for example, and we see the innovation that we see in the renewables. The fastest producer of solar voltaics. They show innovation in solar voltaics. There's incredible potential for growth. When we think about solar energy and we compare it with our petroleum counterparts, the price of petroleum hasn't really changed that much over the last 50 years. Our technology with petroleum hasn't significantly improved, except that we have to go deeper and deeper to mine these products. But solar energy has improved in its cost, and there's so much more to gain. We only basically collect around 20% of the available energy from solar. So if we can innovate in that regard, there's so much more to gain. There is the potential with solar energy that if we innovate properly, that the price of solar could be an order of magnitude less than it is today. And that would be a complete game changer when you want to think about anything else to do with society. And if in climate change, carbon capture and storage, that cannot be applied at a global scale because of its colossal cost. Well, the colossal cost is related to the cost of energy. Imagine what we could do if we put our innovation, our drive, our geopolitical will into trying to reduce even further the price of solar and wind and geothermal. And the leader at the moment is China.
Benjamin, what's the best you're hoping for from this climate summit? What needs to happen in 2 weeks' time?
We also need to think about those who are more vulnerable than ourselves. I mean, the wicked problem of climate change is that the people that aren't responsible, let's think of the communities in Jamaica. The average person in Jamaica contributed a minuscule amount of carbon dioxide. But we've heard from Jamaica that they've lost a third of their GDP from that event. So we need to make sure we protect these most vulnerable people, and then we can have a prosperous future. I mean, I'm a climate scientist. I know the realities of this, but I also know the hope that is available. And the hope is all the innovation that is taking place through startup companies, through universities, through small, medium and large enterprises. We just need to have a common framework, a common language, and come together to solve this problem, because at some point it's going to be too late. At the moment, at COP30, it's not too late. But if we haven't done anything, I would say by COP35, then we're in real trouble, because these planetary boundaries would have been passed, and it'll be a point of no return.
Benjamin Horton, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.